All right, so welcome back to another Bicep live stream. This is the third live stream in our series, and we are glad you all made it back because you want to learn a little bit more about Bicep. And today we will focus on more advanced topics, structures, and we also cover modules, and we'll reveal the secret what modules actually are. So we'll dive into 4 different areas today. But before we do that, 2 more things. So number 1, the session will be recorded, and we will add it to our playlist afterwards. So no worries if you couldn't make it. So you will have it available afterwards. And the link to the full series is in the deck as well. And second, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A window to ask. We will try to answer the questions during the presentation, or if we, for some reason, cannot answer the questions during, we will definitely answer the questions after the presentation at the very end. All right, let's quickly introduce us, and we'll start with Martin.
Hey, good evening or good morning, wherever you are. So I'm Martin. So besides being Marcel's sidekick in this Bicep series, I'm an actor MVP based in Norway and work for a company here called Vipps. It's a payment platform for mobile payments and also merchants and stores and so on. Apart from that, I like to ski in the winter, and I have a race car that I drive during the summer. So that's my short intro.
All right, thanks very much. Yeah, some words about myself. I'm also an Azure MVP. I work out of Switzerland, so I work for SoftwareOne. We help customers with their full transformation journey towards the cloud. And I'm the team lead for a local team that's located here in Switzerland. And beside my day job, I deliver presentations every now and then, mainly about Azure or Microsoft Cloud topics. So we're happy to be here. And that said, let's dive into the 4 topics we want to cover. And as as always, I will do the talking, work on the slide deck together with you, and then Martin will take care of all the exciting demos. All right, so it's in the title, and it says we want to talk about Azure Bicep modules. So what are modules? Modules allow you to decompose your code. So imagine you have a complex application that you want to deploy. Even if you're using Bicep compared to ARM, this could lead to lots of code, right? And what we want to do is we want to create kind of reusable elements, and this is exactly what modules are. So modules allow you to define, code fragments that we store in Bicep files, because a module is nothing but a Bicep file that has parameters that deploys something and that generates output. And at the very end, it's nothing but a Bicep file that is called by another Bicep file. So you kind of decompose your code across multiple Bicep files. And at the very end, you deploy your main or your master Bicep file. It will call all the different modules to generate the final code. So this is actually what modules are. Now, what's also possible is that you nest a module within a module. And so that means that, just as an example, you could have a module for every single resource type that you want to deploy into the Azure platform. And then again, have kind of modules on the next level that use certain of these first level modules to deploy a more complex service, such as, let's say, a web application that also needs a SQL server in the database. And then this module could be called from your main deployment file. Right. At the very end, what happens behind the scenes is when you consume a module, that code is kind of constructed for you, and a so-called nested template is created. So at the very end, we will deploy nested code, and you will see afterward what that actually means. Now, to consume a module, you can see the example here, we use the module keyword. Right, so instead of deploying a resource, we use the module keyword saying, all right, I want to use a module, which means I want to somehow use code that lives in some other Bicep file. I need to assign, again, an identifier to my consumed module, and then I define, well, where my Bicep file actually is. In this case here, it's just a module that deploys a single subnet. And then, of course, depending on that module you're consuming, you need to submit input parameter values, such as in this case, the name or the address prefix and the virtual network name. So it's the same, more or less, as deploying a resource, but you're deploying something that you prepared in your own Bicep file. Good. So that will be a big chunk of Martin's demo afterwards. Then a second thing that's important to understand is that there are times when you will not deploy everything in one go, right? So that means you might somehow deploy something that is dependent or that has kind of a connection to an already existing resource. So in this case, you can see that in the second part, I'm again deploying a subnet by using a module, but the network itself, so the virtual network, is obviously already deployed onto the Azure platform. Now, of course, I could also deploy the network with this, but if I only want to deploy, in this case, a subnet and attach that to an already existing network, then I somehow need to have this information available to instruct the subnet module which network the subnet should go to, right? And for that, I use the resource keyword here, but instead of deploying the virtual network, I use this existing keyword saying, well, this is already existing, so don't deploy this, but get the information from it, and I will tell you where it is. So in this case, it's VNet01 that lives in some resource group with the name AVD in this case. And by that, I now have all the properties of this virtual network available, and I can use the different properties, for instance, to deploy my subnet by using the module afterwards, because there, of course, I need to submit the virtual network name. As you can see here, I just reference to the virtual network resource that is using the existing VNet. So this is also a very important thing you need to understand, because very often you have kind of a core infrastructure already deployed, and then you will just kind of hook up or connect to the already existing resources. All right, the third element or process we want to discuss is conditions. Now, what is this? Depending on your scenario, it's possible that you don't want to deploy all the described resources or modules all the time. So maybe you just want to deploy parts of your code because you just want to test something, right? And for that, we have another keyword, which is if. So it's the if keyword. And you can use that for resources and for modules. So that means you can describe a resource, but instead of deploying it every time, you use the if keyword saying, well, only deploy this resource if some condition is true. And the same is actually true if you want to deploy something using a module. Exactly the same. So use the module keyword and use the if keyword after that, saying, well, only deploy this module if something is actually true. And you can see at the bottom how this works. So there's a condition that is checked, and if this condition resolves to true, the resource or the module will be deployed. If it resolves to false, it will not be deployed. Right? And you can use Boolean values. such as here. So you could have a parameter in your code saying, well, I have a deploy parameter that I can set to true or false, and then use the value of this in my if condition. But then you can also use, for instance, string values. So you want to check some parameter that is submitted as a string value, and depending on that value, I want to deploy a resource or not. Right? So this gives you total flexibility. And also here, to give you a quick example, you can see in this case, again, I describe my module I want to use to deploy a subnet. But instead of deploying it all the time, I want to be able to control the deployment with a deploy parameter. So deploy in this case would be a parameter that I set to either true or false. And again, if it resolves to true here, then the subnet will be deployed. Otherwise, it will not be deployed. So this is how conditions works. All right, and finally, you also need to understand deployment scopes. Now, when you deploy a Bicep file, there's 3 different scopes you can use to deploy Bicep files, and the same is true for ARM templates, right? So whenever you deploy Bicep, it's up to you to decide, well, is this code deployed to a resource group, which is mainly used if you deploy new resources, or do you want to deploy something at the subscription management group or tenant level? So this, for instance, is used when you want to deploy policy definitions or role assignments, those kind of things, right? And so when you create your Bicep file and it's ready to be deployed, you then start a deployment, for instance, using the AC command, so the Azure CLI, and from there you define, all right, so I want to deploy my code into a resource group, or I want to deploy my code into a subscription. So you select the scope when you actually start or initiate the deployment. All right. But now there are times when you want to deploy your code, for instance, at multiple scopes or to multiple resource groups. So let's say you deploy a service and this service is built based on whatever, 2 service components that should live in different resource groups. That at the very end means that you first need to deploy the resource groups, so the empty resource groups. And a resource group needs to be deployed at subscription level, right? But then in the same code, you want to have all the resources that will later be deployed into these 2 new resource groups, right? And that deployment obviously needs to go into the resource group itself. So it will be a resource group level deployment, right? And to actually make this controllable so that we can deploy whatever we want at the scope that we want, we can define what scope a specific element goes to. So as you can see here, in this module that I'm consuming, which does nothing but deploy a resource group, I use this scope keyword saying, well, please use the subscription scope for the subscription I'm connected to right now. And that would mean that I could now take this Bicep code, deploy it into a resource group, for instance, but the resource group here that's described at this level will still be deployed at the subscription level, and it will not go into resource group because obviously that will not work, right? So that means you can mix and match different elements, resources, and modules that are deployed to different scopes by using the scope keyword. That's very important for larger deployments. All right, so enough said. And I will hand over for Martin now for his demos. Martin.
Ah, perfect. So let me just pull up my screen. So here we are in my latest Bicep files. So for those of you who have followed these sessions, you know that everything from our live stream are available on GitHub, and this one is as well. And that's for you to consume however you want and also watch our videos that we will, like myself said, publish a little bit later. Just so to kind of start with where Marcel finished, I have this folder structure where I have a few modules, and I also have this main file. It doesn't have to be called main.bicep, but that's what it's called in this particular instance. So for this to work as it is created now, I need to set my scope. There's a few ways that you can do this, but in this case, I'm setting the target scope at my main file, my main.bicep file. And the reason I do this is I want to create resource group. So here I have the resource, and I am calling the resource group provider directly from my main file. And that's why I need to set the target scope at the subscription. So the subscription that I'm connected to is my target scope. And since all resources live inside the resource group, I need to then reference the resource group I just created up here when I am consuming the module. I have a SQL module down here, and I call it with this module function. So then I want to place this SQL server into the resource group that I created just above, and then I set the scope to this resource group. So that's an implicit dependency that we have talked about a little bit earlier, or in our earlier streams. So I can just reference this friendly name, and it will create an implicit dependency on that resource group. So it will know that it needs to create the resource group before it starts on the modules section. And down here we have to specify the name. This is the deployment name. So like myself said, we have nested deployments in the end. So when ARM on the Azure cloud side translates this into essentially ARM templates, it will collapse everything into a single file with a nested deployment. And then I need to pass in all the parameters that are mandatory or the additional parameters for the module that I would like to pass in. So you can see that I am using a Boolean value and I have an integer value, and I am also getting some of the parameters from my main file. So I can set parameters on the main file and use the same parameters in the modules call. If we then take a look at the SQL file or the SQL module, so everything is just bicep files. It doesn't matter how you structure, or it does matter how you structure it, because there are some limitations here and there, but in general, everything is just bicep files. The main is a bicep file and the module itself is a bicep file. And you can basically say that everything is a module. So if we go into this SQL module, and there's no scope defined in the top of this file. So the scope was set in the main file and also in the modules scope, modules call. So this SQL file is a standard running on a standard scope. So if you would deploy this alone without doing it from the main file, it would be a resource group level deployment, because that's the default level of deployment. So this module uses everything and beyond what we have shown in our earlier or previous live stream. So we have using functions to create unique strings for the SQL Server name. We have conditional deployments down here somewhere, and we also have this array or object configuration based on what kind of SQL database server type we're using. So it's a general purpose hyperscale, and it's using now, it's kind of concatenating the inputted capacity from the parameter and setting the correct SKU when we are actually deploying the resource. Again, manipulating what's being inputted, so we know that this storage account for the SQL Server audit logs and so on will be correct for what the storage account provider can handle. So you can't have hyphens, for example, so you need to translate them to and remove those, so on. Also, again, max character of 24 for the storage account that we have talked about previously, only lowercase letters, etc. Using the same location as the resource group, yet another function that is that we have talked about. And also, let's find some of the conditions. So here we have the if. So I only want audit logs to be enabled on this server if the environment input is set to prod, so production. Again, a little bit further down, we have this sort of ternary condition. So hyperscale database do not support the zone redundancy. So then we set, if you choose hyperscale as the type of SQL server, then it's false. For anything else, it's true. That's just using all the tricks that we have showed you earlier. But in the very end now, just to create some confusion or to show how modules actually are modular. Now, yeah, and again, setting R back and stuff for the SQL Server. So down in the end here, you can see that we have this if statement again. So this is based on the Boolean value that we are sending from the main file. So this Boolean value called connect to VNet, that's set to true. It's not mandatory, but we want to connect this SQL Server to VNet. But since all my VNets are handled by another code base, I need the VNets do not have the same life cycle as my SQL servers. So I handle all VNets in a separate code base, but I still want this SQL server to be connected to it. And I am now calling a module which I named existing VNets.bicep, and I only want to do this if I pass in this Boolean value connect to VNet. This module is a little bit different from what you've probably seen before. I need to pass in some information from this SQL module. And the VNet itself does not necessarily need to live in the same subscription or resource group that the SQL server is deployed to. So now we can kind of have an inception of modules, different subscriptions, cross subscriptions or resource groups, and so on. And also this existing vnet.bicep file, it does not deploy the vnets itself. So depending on, actually this is only allowed to pass in SQL, but again, I am referring to existing vnets. The module is responsible for connecting the virtual network rule, but not responsible for handling the vnets itself. So you can imagine if I want to extend this module to allow connection for storage accounts to the same vnets and another subnet or the same subnets, then I can expand or extend this resource type function or parameter up here to allow for storage to be inputted, for example. And then since my SQL server is not deployed in the same resource group or subscription as the SQL server, I need to pass in which source subscription is it with resource name and resource group and so on. And then I can handle this everything in the environment configuration down here. So this is where my VNets live. They live in a separate subscription. And the SQL subnet is based on the environment. So if it's production, then it's called SQL prod -net. I pass in everything that I need for this module. Then it calls or uses this existing decorator. And I am traversing through this object like I shown you earlier. So we are moving or basically navigating this environment config, getting the correct subnets. And then again, an if statement. So if the resource type sent to this module is of type SQL, then we are getting this server. And then I have, as you can see here, I have set the scope for where I can find this server that was deployed in the main file. The SQL file over here. I am passing in the resource description and the resource group to this existing VNet module. And from there, I can use this to actually provision the virtual network rules. So now we have some sort of inception around modules and cross subscription deployments. And again, we need to reference the SQL server name coming from this existing. This one. So you're just getting information about the server that we just provisioned, and then we can grab the subnet ID, which we get from here, and then it will be deployed. When everything is done, it's 3 modules. We have this main file, creates the resource group, and then we have the SQL module, and then we are using the reference for existing VNets in a separate module. You could, of course, reference the VNets inside the SQL module, but if you imagine you have multiple resource modules, all capable of connecting to a VNet, then you need to, if you change the VNet names or something like that, you need to manage all the files. That's why I had this example where you put it into a separate module. So how does it look? We can go into the visualizer And then you can see we have the SQL Server resource group. We have existing subnets module, and we have the SQL module in the outer ring. And we also have inside here the individual sub-resource types of the SQL. So backup, the DB itself, the audits, vulnerability assessment, role-based access control, stuff like that. Let's try to deploy it. It will take a couple of minutes, but so when this is deploying, let's take a look at how a large infrastructure deployment can actually look when you go into production. This is an example from my daily job. So you can see that my main file calls a magnitude of submodules that again calls another set of submodules. So this is just one example to show how you can grow and how you can modularize your entire infrastructure deployment. So if you zoom a little bit in, you can see there's a lot of, you have vaults, you have secrets, access policies, VNets, NFTs. Everything is kind of connected to the resource group. Now, going in to our deployments, you can see that the Bicep Module Demo SQL, that's the name of the deployment here. Now it's finished with the resource group, started the modules call for SQL, and it also called this connect subnet module. You can see inside this. Oh, it's completed, but if you would have checked it before you completed, you will see that it was individual deployments inside the SQL module as well. And this SQL server could now be connected to our network as well. So going into firewalls and virtual network, you can see I passed in production as my environment, and it's connected to pod VNet, and that is and inside existing VNet module. So if I pass in prod, it will use this as a value when calling the existing subnets. I think that, Marcel, this is what I had to show. Do you see any questions coming in, or is everyone silent?
Well, first off, thanks for the demo. That was pretty impressive. I can imagine if you've seen modules for the first time, this was a little bit complex, but I think if people dive into your code that is published in the repository, they will definitely better understand how this works. But thanks a lot for the demo. That was great.
No problem.
And there's no question, but as there's no question, I will have two questions for you. The first one is, now as you have a deployment that deploys a resource group and then the resources into this new resource group, we have seen that, well, you have showed the deployment progress, right, at the resource group level, but how can people actually see the resource group itself, so where the resource group is deployed? Can you maybe quickly show that at the subscription level, so where you see the subscription level deployments, so just to complete this picture?
Yes, of course. So that will be a subscription level deployment. So in the portal, you will see that, well, at least it says failed here. I'm not sure. That's probably something that hangs, but you will see that in the resource group will be deployed in at the resource group level. So down here, you see deploy the resource groups, and then the modules for SQL is at the resource group level. So I guess Azure has some issues with showing the correct icons. So it's completed and not completed, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think that's also important to understand that, of course, you first have to, well, not first, but if you want to somehow monitor the subscription level deployments, you really have to do that at subscription level, obviously. And
yeah.
Then for all the resource group level deployments, for those elements, you go down to the appropriate resource groups.
Yeah, I guess you can see I'm not sure if you can see the entire chain, or if you have to actually move about and stuff like that inside. If you want to look at it from the portal, that is, but if you get your deployment through PowerShell or something, you will see all the steps that it has performed. So again, in the deployment section, you can see connected to subnet and the SQL module. So that's true.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. And then maybe a second question I have that you might be able to answer. We have seen now that you used Bicep modules that have been stored in the same path as your deployment file or deployment Bicep file was stored. Is it somehow possible to use a remote path to access your Bicep files?
A remote file, like available on the internet, or a path?
Well, both to make it a bit more complex for you, both.
Yeah, basically everything is possible, if that's allowed to say, but the path route is actually the simplest one. So you will, if you just change this down here, you can see if I go, you can go up, of course, to intro, advanced parameters and functions. I can just call this one instead, and then the IntelliSense, it will of course say that this doesn't work because this file does not have these parameters. So yeah, everything is possible.
Perfect. Thank you. So you can build kind of a folder structure to organize your modules, but then without any issue reference to the different modules that are stored in different folders.
Yes.
Very good. Thanks a lot. All right. So for now, there's no more questions. So let's continue or close the session with the slides. It's just a few more. Then people still have time to ask questions. All right. Where is it? There we go. Good. So as we said, we will publish the recording together with all the other recordings, and you can easily access the full playlist by using this URL. And this contains not only Bicep live streams, but also some recordings we did last year for ARM templates. I think that's also 4 or 5 recordings we did in 2020. That's also available using this URL. And then look out to the next and unfortunately already the last live stream. This will be on October 6th. And then we will talk about pipeline-based deployments. So for now, we've seen how we can, well, deploy Bicep files from the command line manually. But if you want to bring this into a standardized process, then we might need pipelines. And this is what we will cover in that next live stream, together with 1 or 2 other things. So I just mentioned some fancy keywords here. So we will also cover a little bit or quickly a thing called template specs and also a linter to complete that full Bicep story. So stay tuned for all of these awesome topics. And that said, I see there's still no questions appearing here. Yeah, what do you think, Martin? I think that's it from our side then. We'll close the stream here. And yeah, we're looking forward to have you back in 2 weeks for the last live stream. So thanks for listening. Enjoy the rest of the day or the night or the evening, and see you soon. Thanks, and also thanks, Martin, for the demos. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.